we will get started. So, thank you for the introduction. I really do appreciate it, and I thank you all for showing up again this week. Hopefully, I didn't scare you off or anything with what is Bitcoin last week, but this week we will be talking about the history of money in the global financial system. So, we're really not going to talk about Bitcoin at all or any of this type of stuff today because we need to get the context down for money and how this system actually works. So we're going to be covering a ton of different topics, and I've tried to summarize everything in the best way I think I can, because there's a lot of these subtopics that you could spend another hour, 30 minutes on like each individual one. So we are going to start with what is money. So when you think of money, normally you would probably think of the U.S. dollar bill or a euro or peso, bolivar, any of these types of currencies, right? But an unfortunate reality of the question of what is money is that honestly very few people, especially in the United States, actually know what money really is or what it should be. So in my schooling, and this is very similar for many people my age especially, I was never required to take any classes on economics or finance. And in 2014, personally, I opened my first bank account and received a debit card, a checkbook, and my parents told me that I should budget and learn how to manage my money. Now, I will say that I didn't really take that step into learning how to budget until I had a full-time job, but I learned that my income should be higher than my expenses. So this led me to saving more than consuming. Now, this is how I operated for many years, but one day I decided to ask myself the question, what is money? What is the dollar bill that I hold in my hand? What is its history? Why are there other currencies? Why don't we all just use one? This is one of the oldest forms of technology known to man, and yet why are there so many people that do not understand it? Little did I know that it would lead me into a world where I knew absolutely nothing about, and it would lead me down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, and now I'm a Bitcoiner. So once I started to dig deep into studying what money truly was as a concept and technology, it made me really appreciate why Bitcoin was created, and I hope to share that with you today. So we will start with a medium of exchange. So the technology of money, in the simplest form, is meant to be a representation of information as an exchange of time and energy expended from a person's labor. Okay. The first property of money is defined by its function as a medium of exchange. It is a good that is purchased not for its own sake, but for the sake of being exchanged for other goods in the future. It is meant to be incredibly liquid, measured in the size of the market in which the good is traded, and it's also meant to be salable, which is measured in the ease of buying and selling of a good on the market. Okay. So originally, one of our earliest forms of trade was barter. Now, lack of coincidence of wants created from barter is defined as when you have a good or service that you want to get rid of, you want to exchange it, however, nobody wants it. A great example of this can be applied with an apple and a car, right? So barter can work on a small scale within a community of few people, but on a large scale it doesn't work. So when you think of an apple and car, and we're going to go through each of the subtopics of this, you can realize that there becomes a problem eventually with trying to use apples as money and trying to use a car as money. Okay, so for lack of coincidence of scales, what you want to exchange is not the same value as what you want, and the divisibility is not practical. So if a person wants a car, but you only have the apples, nobody would want the amount of apples that it takes to buy the car, right? At least I wouldn't, because it doesn't make a lot of sense. Okay. Then you have a lack of coincidence of time. You want to try to sell something today to buy something else in the future. Say the exchange between a car and apples did actually happen. The problem with exchanging the apples is the fact that they quickly decay and become worthless, right? And then we have a lack of coincidence of locations. So Trying to sell something that is immovable, like a house, or it becomes very expensive to move. A car nor apples really would work as great forms of money due to the fact that it is incredibly expensive to move. So, how is the lack of coincidence of wants solved? The most practical way to solve this is to find an intermediary good with which the people could then exchange for the good that they want. In other words, resorting to indirect exchange. We have seen this within human history in many cases, and this intermediary good is what we know as money. It becomes a medium of exchange naturally as a phenomenon, normally. There is no authority or overhead that declared what money originally was. So now we have a concept of salability. So in Carl Menger's economic writings, he takes into account that salability is one of the most crucial factors in determining what becomes money through the human action. We have salability across scales, locations, and time. So a money that can solve salability across scales serves well in that the good is divisible and groupable, right? Across locations, a money serves well in that the good is valuable per unit of weight and it's very easy to move. Across time, money serves well in that the good does not ruin and it is also not cheap to produce. As industrial production has advanced throughout time, there becomes a problem with the first two specifically of scales and locations, but also physical integrity over time. The factor that ends up mattering the most is the hardness of production and its relationship to salability across time. The better store of value, the more likely that a medium of exchange will succeed in the long run. Okay? So, a medium of exchange and a store of value cannot operate outside of one another. If something serves great as a medium of exchange, then it also has to have some sort of value to it. Otherwise, what are you trading? The same is applied when something is a great store of value. It will eventually become the best medium of exchange. As you study human history, what people have agreed on as the best store of value normally ends up being the best medium of exchange. An important thing to understand is that any good can work as money. So, my phone, this water bottle, this microphone, anything can work. Doesn't matter. However, not every good is a great store of value, like the apples example from before. A common characteristic of forms of money throughout history is the presence of some mechanism to restrain the production of new units of the good to maintain the value of the existing stock. The relative difficulty of producing new monetary units determines the hardness of money. And then we get this concept of hard versus easy money. So money whose supply is hard to increase is known as hard money, while easy money is defined by a supply that can be increased with a lot of ease, and it costs practically nothing. So a good way to measure this is called the stock-to-flow ratio. So it is defined as the total stockpiles of a good available at any point in time, that is stock. Flow is new production of the good, and then you have, of course, consumption of the stock. And the stock-to-flow ratio gives us an idea about the relative magnitude of the existing stockpiles in the market compared to the new production. Okay? A good with a low stock-to-flow ratio is one whose supply is roughly the same as its stockpile. Most commodities have a stock-flow ratio of around 1. For an example, wheat's stock-to-flow is 1. Normally, you have the same exact amount of flow coming in as the current stock and supply. But because we consume so much wheat, wheat is not the greatest store of value. Okay? And so throughout time, the stock-to-flow ratio, if you measure this against a lot of other commodities, can give you an idea of which is the better store of value. So gold is the one commodity that has built the best ratio over thousands of years. It is rare that gold is consumed in industrial purposes, so the stock continues to grow. And the flow of gold is pretty constant. It ranges from roughly about 1% to 2% every single year. This is based on data from at least the past 100 years. So 100 years ago as well, silver had roughly a stock-to-flow ratio of around 20. However, due to its increased use in industrial purposes, that has varied a lot over time. And honestly, in my eyes, I see silver has decreased in its stock-to-flow ratio, and it also is manipulated by governments across the world, being able to just easily release silver onto the markets. So it's kind of hard to measure in terms of gold and silver what the true stock-to-flow ratio is, but overall, we've known gold to be the best over time. So unit of account is our third property of money. As salability of a good increases, it attracts more buyers and sellers, which in turn reinforces its salability. There is a network effect to money because there's a significant benefit in unifying the standard unit in which all prices are expressed. The ability to denominate prices all in one medium of exchange makes a money a good unit of account, the good whose exchange rate against other goods is used most often. So then you can build like complex trade relationships, international trade, producing capital goods, investment goods, and consumption goods overall. So let's start with really some of the first forms of money. Once we passed barter, we moved into primitive money. Some of the earliest forms of money included stones, glass beads, cowrie shells, animal teeth, and much more. One of the most fascinating ones to me, though, are the rye stones from the island of Yap in Micronesia. The reason these stones were used as money by the Yapese is that limestone did not exist on the island, so they found it to be very scarce. They would need to go to other islands, quarry the limestone with very primitive tools, and transport it back on canoes and rafts across the waters. Some of the stones transferred sometimes took years and even resulted in the loss of life to transport. So these were very costly and hard to produce. These stones have been dated for being used possibly around 2,000 years until the early 1900s. The properties of this money is pretty cool. Ownership of the rock did not require the rock to move. And interestingly enough, they actually function very similarly to Bitcoin. Nobody gets to keep physical possession of the rocks. The ownership is established through, at least in their case, an oral consensus. So the entire town has to be informed of every single transaction, and everybody recognizes it or verifies it, similar to how every computer on Bitcoin's network does for each transaction on Bitcoin's blockchain. So the salability of these stones across space, small rocks are easier to move, but large rocks are obviously harder to move. And it was also useless outside of this island. Across scales, it was not really divisible or groupable, but smaller rocks, of course, did exist. Across time, they did not really ruin. I mean, you can see they kind of chipped maybe, but they kept them together, and the supply was significantly difficult to increase. Now, it's important to note that the reason some of these stones are very large is arguably due to the result of inflation after many, many centuries, causing the value of the small rocks to actually decline. And a big reason primitive money stopped being used along with other primitive forms of money, like the rye stones, glass beads, any of those types of things, was due to industrial technology and the fact that primitive money did not work well in international trade. When European explorers found out many of these primitive cultures were using money that the Europeans could easily produce, they decided to bring in their own supply and inflated the primitive economies out of existence. In the rye stones case, some of the Yapese actually did understand scarcity and initially refused any type of European rye stones. However, caused conflict on the island, and then some people started taking in the rye stones, and ultimately it was the demise of the rye stone by the early 1900s. Moving on to monetary metals. Eventually we got to just metal in general, which beats all forms of primitive money. And throughout time, metals such as iron, copper, silver, and gold have been used. Over time, we also have seen a move away from stuff like iron because only rare metals would keep their monetary role. Some metals are much too easy to produce. There's an abundance of iron in the world, and it also degrades pretty quickly based on oxidation. But those metals have a low stock-to-flow ratio. Then eventually, only indestructible metals kept its monetary role. Silver has lost its monetary role to gold, which is in fact the harder money because gold is practically indestructible and is the least reactive of any of the monetary metals. And then silver can corrode over time, and it's more abundant. So we got to coinage eventually. So this actually boosted gold and silver's monetary role, and this was mainly due to the fact of the rise of the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire had established such a insane global trade base that their coins were actually accepted across the world. With the world moving to monetary metals and the innovation of coinage, it helped human civilization, production, and economic output like never before. With the world coming together under a much more uniform standard, it allowed for more specialization and increased trade and capital accumulation and living standards that had never been seen. So, now the fall of the Roman Empire. There is a good book called Gold Wars by Ferdinand Lipps that covers a lot of this time period. The reason the fall of the Roman Empire is important to understand is because it largely shows what can happen to a nation when the currency is manipulated. Now, I do want to note there are definitely other factors that caused the fall of the Roman Empire. However, I will argue that the debasement of their currency over time was a very large factor as well. Over time, from emperor to emperor, to fund government expenditures and wars, the Roman leadership would require all of its citizens to turn in their current currency that they held so that they could be issued a new one with a new emperor's face. The government would then proceed to melt down the coins and create new ones with this emperor's face, and also take out the amount of gold and silver that were in the original coins, but then tell the people that they actually had the original amount of weight in them. So realistically, people are not dumb. They figured this out. And eventually there was a lot of severe inflation that ensued over the time of the empire. And I believe that this was a lot of the reason that it did eventually collapse, because the Roman Empire expanded way too much based on their government spending, and there was just too much chaos going on due to inflation. So citizens then moved to empty lands to escape the high taxes, and then this is when Europe entered the Dark Ages and serfdom and all that stuff that went along with it. And eventually the Renaissance came about, and so on. So inflation for the Roman Empire was actually ended by Emperor Constantine, who adopted the solidus coin, eventually renamed the Byzant, and it survived for centuries as the Byzantine Empire thrived. Later on, this would be adopted as the Islamic dinar and is now the longest-serving currency in human history that we know of. And this is used in some Middle Eastern and African countries today. So, the rise of gold in its ultimate form. So fast forwarding a little bit through time to the 19th century now, after the Napoleonic Wars, gold was becoming much more widely adopted. After the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, silver's role as a monetary metal declined significantly and continued to fail at becoming a globally accepted monetary metal time and time again because gold was being much more accepted. And a large problem with silver is its production and supply can increase a lot quicker than that of gold. And a good case study of this was in 1980 with the Hunt brothers. So overall, Gold continues to be the hardest monetary metal that we know of because its stock continues to increase over time, and it really is not consumed for industrial purposes like we talked about earlier. So if we look at gold salability, it has proven to be the best across time because it resists this decay and destruction, and it's continually grown its stock to flow, making it more valuable. It actually does have a really great salability across space. It's very easy to transfer gold coins or gold bullion, as we know today, or gold ingots. And overall, it just made global trade a lot easier to transfer a large amount of value in such a small amount. So overall, this was accepted as kind of the standard for a while. But gold was not necessarily the greatest unit of account, and that is also where silver kind of stepped in at times, and we've seen this throughout time with like the Roman Empire to many early Chinese dynasties, even to just gold being used. Sometimes silver did step in to allow smaller units of gold to be traded. Overall, I believe the fall of silver's monetary role is mainly due to the fact of modern banking, as we know, and also better methods of communication, like the telegraph, and of course now the internet. But this was mainly due to the fact that you then with modern banking could have these paper exchanges or certificates that you could get gold back from. So enter La Belle Epoque, or the Gilded Age in America. And this was a time from 1871 roughly to about World War I. And I think the reason it's a good case study to look at this time period is because everybody was under this unified gold standard, except China. They were the only ones still using silver. So under sound money, it is more likely that individuals engage in long-term investments and have larger amounts of capital not based on credit or debt, but savings, allowing people to finance projects that took a lot of time to pay off. Many of the projects and investments were well planned and thought out, because financing a project based on your actual savings account is a lot more risky than cheap debt. From this result, I believe it created one of the best innovative eras we have ever known in human history. So from 1870 to 1914, we were under this purely gold standard, like I said, but there is data to prove that, really we took off as a human civilization in terms of innovation. So some of the stuff we take for granted today was invented in this time. This includes things like hot and cold running water, indoor toilets, plumbing, central heating, electricity, internal combustion engine, mass production, automobiles, airplanes, subways, countless number of health and medicine advancements, stainless steel, telephones, and the first general purpose computer. And the list goes on and on. And until the beginning of World War I, where everything would really take a toll, we in the 20th century really built on top of this era and the innovations that were made. There are definitely a lot more products that have been made in the 20th century and 21st century, but a lot of the innovation and original invention, I believe, did come from this era. So before we get into the beginning of government money, it is a good thing to cover the basis of Keynesian versus Austrian economics. So I'm not going to cover classical or neoclassical economics because today in our modern world, we fall more under this Keynesian economic system after the Great Recession in 2007, 2009 time frame. However, I believe Austrian economic principles are starting to make a large revival, and mainly this is due to the fact that people are starting to want a sound money system, especially Bitcoiners and gold bugs. So Keynesian economic theory was created by John Maynard Keynes on the left, in the early 1900s. His theory is the belief that the government should intervene in the economy to change the aggregate demand, and government should control monetary policy by adjusting interest rates or the money supply at will. He argued that it is fully necessary that the government continue to spend so that the economy can maintain full employment. Realistically, it is a case for government control over an economy and using mathematical models to predict what will actually happen in the economy. So, on the right side, with Friedrich Hayek, the original father of Austrian economics is Karl Menger, but Friedrich Hayek butted heads with John Maynard Keynes a lot during this time period, pre-World War I. So Austrian economic theory is based on letting nature take its course and less government interference in free markets. And they argue that the less that there is government interference, the better that it will be. The Austrian view believes economics is more of a subjective topic as well, something that cannot be predicted by mathematics due to human nature and social influences. Every single economic decision a person makes can be completely different from person to person, which brings in too many factors to plot inside of a mathematical model, right? So for one of you, I might find something more valuable, like my MacBook, right, than you may find valuable. So there's a lot of things to consider within just our human nature of what we value and what we want. Personally, I believe in Austrian economic theory, mainly because to me it makes a lot more sense. It doesn't make a ton of sense thinking that people will continue to consume if we don't create artificial demand by injecting into the economy from government mandates. In order for people to thrive and survive, no matter what, humans are going to always have to consume. But I believe with the Keynesian side, they believe that there's too much fear that it would cause global economic depression if government did not interfere. And in our case today, I believe that to be true, because if we decided to not intervene anymore, then we would have a large depression. But we'll get to why that is leading through government money. So in the early 1900s, economic instability began to ensue not only in the United States, but also some parts of Europe. There was a lot going on, but this was mainly due to overextended issuance of money supply and gold reserves not being backed up and only being held inside of banks, becoming a lot more centralized. So for the United States, this led to the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, so creating the US dollar. And then eventually in Europe, it led to World War I. So World War I believe, ended the gold standard completely. We'll talk about the classical gold standard versus the gold exchange standard, which ended in 1971, but I believe the classical gold standard was ended completely during this time. This is due to the suspension of government currency redeemable for gold, and thus fiat, the Latin term for decree or authorization, was born. Almost all gold trade internationally in World War I was suspended. At this time, governments continued to maintain the facade of the currency's value, remaining at its pre-war peg to gold, even as prices inflated. So an important concept to understand here is that there is a very large difference between government money redeemable in gold and irredeemable government money, even if both are run by the government. Understand a gold standard, or under a gold standard, people can redeem their government-issued currency for gold at any time, regardless of the supply in the economy, because the government should have no control of the supply of gold in the economy. With irredeemable government money, the government's debt and or paper-issued currency is used as money, and a government can increase the supply of that paper currency when they see it fit, which is the world we live in today. So another interesting fact to note is that no current fiat money has ever come into circulation solely through government decree, even though we call it fiat. They were all originally redeemable in gold or silver, or another currency that was redeemable in gold or silver. Only through redeemability into salable forms of money did government paper money gain its salability. So, in World War I, under the advising of John Maynard Keynes, the Bank of England continued to debase their currency, and the government continued to spend money. And I believe that this is why the war had lasted so long as well. Germany and Austria followed this principle, keeping the war just continually going. And little side note, I guess, there's an interesting story about Christmas Day in some year during World War I, where all the soldiers just completely dropped their weapons and then had food with each other, because they were like, what are we even fighting for? But based on chain of command and whatnot, and government spending, this war continued to linger on. So eventually, by the end of the war, there became this dilemma of whether or not they should get back onto a gold standard, and if so, how to revalue their peg to gold. Should they give a true valuation, meaning they inflate their currency towards gold, or do they try to keep this facade of the pre-war peg? So Britain decided, we'll do the pre-war peg. This led to arbitrage opportunities by selling the £4 an ounce of gold in Britain, going to Switzerland and some other country to sell the gold that you received from Britain and receive about £6 back. And then this loop continued to happen, and gold was flowing out of Britain, and eventually it just continued to inflate the pound. So, in 1922, at the Genoa Conference in Italy, with Britain still being this large power because they did win World War I, they were able to convince other nations to keep the British pound as a reserve currency instead of gold, and only allow large international payments to be settled in gold. So due to this, Britain was able just to convince everybody else to inflate their currency to the pre-war peg to gold, and this led to a system where the U.S. was still on the classical gold standard, and Britain was then on this gold exchange standard, because other countries would take the pound and put that into reserve, while gold was just held basically in Britain and the United States. So the big two currencies that dominated here were the U.S. dollar and the pound. So stacking on top of one another, Britain did not want to lose dollar reserves either, or gold to the United States. So they were able to convince the United States to inflate the dollar through 1928, and the period in the U.S. we know of this economic boom was called the Roaring Twenties. Life was great, everything seemed fine. Until this. So we ended up paying for it with the worst economic disaster in U.S. history. Now, everything during this time was a very, very dark period for the global economy. President Hoover intervened with a lot of errors himself, such as price and wage controls, and trying to keep the inflated dollar peg to pre-1929 crash, and this caused the economy to collapse even further into depression, paving the perfect path for FDR to be elected. So, FDR is elected, and he campaigned on fiscal and monetary policy responsibility against the interventions of Hoover. And then this led into FDR actually taking government intervention into his own hands and creating the New Deal. One of the first things FDR did, though, was on April 5th, 1933, he issued Executive Order 6102, which forbid the hoarding of gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates within the continental United States, forcing Americans to sell their gold to the U.S. Treasury at the rate of $20.37 per ounce. And then eventually, after they got all of the gold, the dollar was then inflated to $35 per ounce, increasing the dollar's inflation to 41%. So this was a very unfortunate time, and this eventually also led up to World War II. So realistically, the abandoning of sound money and the principles taught to all nations that it's okay if you debase your currency led to very major consequences. The nations that prospered together under the gold standard just years earlier now had many barriers between them because there's all of these different exchange rates and there's inflation going on, creating one of the darkest times in human history of World War II. To me, an unethical view I see from the Keynesian economics perspective is the fact that Keynesians believe that war is good for the economy. The Keynesian theory believes all government spending is good, and that specifically both world wars were the reason that the economy recovered in the first place, which I believe is a lie. And then shortly after World War II, we had a conference between 44 nations called the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944. This declared a new gold exchange standard where all countries would respect the US dollar as the global reserve currency. One thing to note during World War II for protection, almost every single country moved their gold reserves to the United States because they didn't want it to be stolen from all of the war happening in Europe. So this gave the United States a lot of leverage to make this deal happen. Like they basically were saying, look, it's okay, we'll hold your gold, we'll keep it in our reserves, but just keep US dollars in your reserves, and then everything is going to be okay. And then we continue to keep the peg to $35 an ounce of gold. So another problem with this system is that it created this reality today that we have really no physical access to gold anymore. All you can get today, realistically, if you want a ton of gold, are just certificates, and you never truly own the gold. So in the system, the United States was the trusted entity to custody all of the gold, to keep the system stable, and up until the 1960s, this actually did work out pretty well for them. Shortly after the assassination of President Kennedy, the U.S. chose a path of great government spending and military spending, and then also, along with this, under Johnson's administration in the Vietnam War, U.S. debt skyrocketed. So foreign nations were starting to see the U.S. public sector in deficits and question if the U.S. would be able to keep the peg to $35 an ounce. So what happened is that eventually we were issuing so much debt that we had $35 billion out in circulation to support $24 billion worth of gold in our reserves. So in August 1971, French President Pompidou became so frustrated with the United States that he sent a battleship to New York City to collect France's gold holdings back from the United States. And then Britain also had asked the United States to prepare $3 billion worth of gold held in Fort Knox to be withdrawn. So, under a lot of pressure, we got the fiat standard. And not that fiat, but this, not that one. Not that one either. We're not there yet. Get back. Get back. There we go. Oh my gosh. My PowerPoint's freaking out. Okay. Go down. There we go. Good. Okay. So, oh no. There we go. Okay. Sorry, my arrow keys just were not mapping correctly. So, starting with the fiat standard, we are going to get into a lot of where my conviction lies with this system. So, under this immense pressure from the public and other nations, on August 15th, 1971, President Nixon told the American people that the United States would temporarily no longer redeem dollars for gold, and the fiat standard we know now was created. Now, notice there's a key word in there. He says temporarily, which ended up being permanently. This was pitched originally as a bid to save the economy as the economy entered an inflationary decade, and this caused a ton of geopolitical pressure during the Nixon administration. So, in 1973, as the United States was supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War, the Arab petroleum exporters of OPEC, the Association of Oil Producing Countries, decided to quadruple the price of world oil and also embargo the United States. So around this time, there were a lot of people that really actually could not get gas. In just a few years, a barrel of oil would rise from $2 to $12, which doesn't seem a lot in today's standards, but that's a significant increase. I mean, that's 500-fold, basically, 600-fold, or six-fold, sorry. Then Ahmed Zaki Yamani, the Saudi Minister of Petroleum, threatened to reduce oil production to 20% of the annual production to use as a geopolitical weapon towards other large world powers. So, with this newfound power and also profit these Saudi Arab nations were making on oil, they actually had so much that they really did not know what to do with their money. And so they had this dilemma where the Saudi oil states were not able to spend their money, and then also the world was struggling for oil. So faced with a lot of this pressure still and rising inflation from a soft default in the United States, Nixon decided, the Nixon administration decided to come up with an idea, and was born the petrodollar. So the petrodollar was a plan basically where the United States needed to get a way for nations to finance our debt by buying our treasuries bonds. So there was really no possible way that any other government was going to really finance this in a direct way, because a lot of trust was fleeing out of the United States. But then also, if you tried to raise taxes for your revenue, people would not be happy. So they came up with this idea as an agreement that Saudi Arabia would now buy U.S. treasuries with the profit made on oil, but also it would enforce that all sales of oil had to be in U.S. dollars. And this is what we now know as the petrodollar. So the Saudis could have chosen not to agree to this deal, but they did in exchange for protection from the United States. So soon after, in 1975, all OPEC nations would then follow Saudi Arabia's lead. And if you wanted to buy oil, you had to pay in U.S. dollars. And at this time, the OPEC nations stored nearly 80% of all the world's petroleum reserves. Due to this deal, the Nixon administration saved the U.S. dollar at the expense of other nations funding our debt. From this deal, oil transactions done with the pound sterling fell from 20% to 6% by 1976. And also within 1 year, the Saudis' import of U.S. military equipment had risen from $300 million to $5 billion. So, what's the impact of the petrodollar system? Domestically in the United States, certain industries have benefited a lot from this system, mainly due to the fact that money supply injected from Saudi Arabia and other nations funding our U.S. treasuries goes straight to corporations or government spending. This is a large reason why the U.S. has become also the financial powerhouse of the world. The impact on the median American, though, has ultimately been negative, as corporations and asset owners benefit a ton from a low interest rate environment whenever those times happen. The dollar also inflates without many things in the economy adjusting, like wages, while prices of everything else go up, leaving many Americans struggling to pay bills. So this is what happened in the 70s, somewhat 80s, and also right now. The problem with rising prices in America, though, and the strengthening of the dollar is the fact that it makes imports cheaper and our consumption also skyrockets while our exports fall. And this was primarily the case in the 70s and 80s. Many of our manufacturing industries took a dive and have really not recovered since then, leaving many middle-class working Americans behind while we continued to increase our trade deficit. Another sad reality of this system is that it also forced every single country, even third world poor ones, to have to find a way to get US dollars in order to buy oil. Across many third world countries, it led to a debt crisis because they had to take on debt in order to get dollars. And this even led to some countries hyperinflating shortly after by inflating their own currency against the dollar to try and save their economies, which has now led to purely cash societies within many third world countries only using the US dollar, which is also still difficult to get at times. Many rich countries benefited a lot from this system because they were the ones taking advantage of the third world countries and keeping them in this trap. I believe one of the greatest examples is the Central Bank of France, who still has control of 15 central banks in Africa through the CFA franc. So this is called monetary colonialism. France, like many European countries, colonized many nations around the world in its imperial days and even during the world wars. So after Nazi Germany occupied France in World War II, the French colonies began to become their own sovereign nations. However, France fought to keep many of the colonies, actually ended up killing many people in order to do this. So when the CFA franc was first introduced in 1945, it was worth 1.7 French francs and then strengthened to 2 French francs in 1948. But when the euro was introduced to the world, the peg dropped from 2 French francs to 0.01 French francs, resulting in a 99.5% debasement. Every time that France devalued the franc, it increased its purchasing power against its former colonies, and it also made it more expensive for those colonies to import vital goods. In 1992, the French were able to vote to adopt the euro or not, but the CFA nationals were not able to vote on the system at all, for they were denied any right. So currently 3 central banks in the African regions hold the foreign exchange reserves for each nation under the 15 nations that are under the system, which must keep 50% with 50% of their reserves with the French Treasury at all times. So CFA nations have no discretion whatsoever with regard to their reserves stored abroad either, and they don't even know how the money is spent or how it's lended out or how it's even used. So there is definitely much more to the system in detail, but we're not going to get into that too much. But overall, the CFA system benefits the French to this day, and 2 of the entities created from like the monetary colonialism, and we know from the Bretton Woods Agreement, was also the World Bank, which is used by the United States, and the International Money Fund that is oversight in Europe. And as much as they pose to be these third world countries' saviors by giving them a ton of money, they also benefit from keeping them in the system and threaten them if they don't accept their wanted policies and rules, which to me is very sad. So this is a topic that does interest me a lot too, mainly due to the fact of what the United States has done to protect the US dollar. So after the creation of the euro, publicly traded in 1999, there was a lot of talk that the euro could possibly unseat the dollar because there was now a group of nations with a similar economic output and population to the United States, now under one unified monetary standard. U.S. policymakers found one of the looming threats to be what is called the petro-euro. So, little context, the history of Saddam Hussein obviously is very chilling, and it's very wrenching to see, of course, what Saddam Hussein had did during the 80s, the 90s, and 2000s. But in October of 2000, Saddam Hussein attempted to alter the petrodollar system when he announced that Iraq would sell oil in euros and not in dollars. And then, during this time, the whole War on Terror campaign happened, and the Bush administration tried to figure out a way to go against Saddam Hussein in Iraq. By February 2003, Saddam Hussein had actually sold 3.3 billion barrels of oil for 26 billion euros, with the French and Germans also on Saddam's side. And ultimately, the petro-euro was born. So, this is what I find very interesting. So, during the Iraqi-Iranian War in the 1980s, even though U.S. intelligence knew Saddam Hussein was breaking the Geneva Protocol of 1925 by using chemical weapons, we still aided him by giving him intelligence on Iran so that he could have an advantage in the war, allowing for thousands to be injured and many killed. From a foreign policy perspective, the U.S. has tended to be more friendly toward Iraq, but in March 2003, on the basis that the U.S. needed to invade Iraq for weapons of mass destruction, a war on terror, involvement with al-Qaeda, and Saddam Hussein needing to be stopped, Operation Iraqi Freedom pursued. And in just the span of 1 month, with the help from the UK, we invaded Iraq and overthrew Saddam Hussein. By June 2003, Iraq was then pricing oil in dollars again. Now, it puzzles me a bit because from publicly released intelligence reports from the CIA, we know that all of the reasons the Bush administration built to invade Iraq ended up actually being false. They had no connection to al-Qaeda, they had no connection to weapons of mass destruction, and we knew a ton of stuff about Iraq. And so I just find it very interesting from a foreign policy perspective. Historians call this operation and war with Iraq a war in search of reason, because nobody can unanimously agree of why we went to war against Saddam Hussein, really. And I'm just saying it does look a little weird from the petro-euro's perspective of trying to protect the US dollar's pricing for oil. So looking through recent history and the US choosing dictators in the world that we needed to go after, we have tended to choose them very specifically. So Gaddafi is another great example. Tried to sell oil for gold dinars in 2009, and 2 years later, in 2011, he was killed. Chavez in Venezuela threatened to sell oil for something other than dollars, and then the U.S. launched an unsuccessful coup attempt, which has only led Venezuela down an even more terrible path, and they have now suffered from hyperinflation in 2018. What really irks me and kind of hurts me personally is the fact that we've kind of turned this blind eye to the Saudi Arabian dictatorship. We've supported them in both Gulf Wars, defending them in many different ways, but 15 of the 9/11 hijackers were Saudi Arabian. Bin Laden was Saudi Arabian, and yet we have never really questioned Saudi Arabia. Every time Saudi Arabia is mentioned in Congress, it tends to be brushed under the rug because it can cause significant harm to national security. The U.S. government has forcibly resisted any attempt to investigate the Saudi regime for involvement in 9/11, and instead we invaded and bombed other countries like Afghanistan. Saudi Arabia commits a large amount of human rights violations every single year and continues to engage in a war with Yemen, and yet it confuses me why we don't ever try to keep them accountable. I don't have a problem with Saudi Arabian people, don't get me wrong, but I do have a problem with turning a blind eye to injustice of a corrupt dictatorship. And to me, it's just wrong to see that based on an agreement of a petrodollar and trying to keep U.S. dollar alive, we tend to let these things happen. And there also are plenty of other foreign policy reasons, but this system is definitely interesting to think about. But today in 2022, I would say that this Saudi Arabian relationship has started to be questioned, and I guess we'll see where it goes, because Saudi Arabia has started to have a lot of links to China. So moving on to digital cash, I'm not going to go over much about the history of debit and credit cards, as these are primarily just different forms of payment for the fiat system, but the history of them is pretty interesting. One thing I will note is the fact that there has been no true innovation in the back end of card payment systems since 1966. And to use this card network, any credit card payment for the merchant results in a 2% to 3% loss on a transaction, depending on the network you're using on the back end by the consumer. This is why there are many places that refuse to take American Express, because they charge extra for whatever reason. On the consumer side, you pay with your credit card, and then you get benefits from the card and using their network in cashback form. And it's a very interesting thing to read about the history of the credit card system and the Visa, MasterCard, and American Express networks. So on to more digital cash. In 1983, David Chaum introduced a paper with the idea of digital cash called eCash. In 1989, he founded DigiCash, an electronic cash company, and then in 1998, it filed for bankruptcy. It was meant to be used as blinded cash, safely being transferred between individuals bearing a signature of authenticity and the ability to be modified without traceability. Now, around 1995, Adam Back, which currently today is the CEO of a company called Blockstream, a Bitcoin company, created Hashcash. The original idea of Hashcash was the proof of work functionality that Bitcoin uses today. But Hashcash failed because there was not enough processing power back in the 90s. In 1996, Dr. Douglas Jackson and Barry Downey created eGold. And this, honestly, was the first widely used internet money. But in 2008, it was ultimately shut down by the U.S. government because people used it for money laundering and illegal activities. In 1998, Nick Szabo proposed BitGold, which is probably one of the most influential currencies to have inspired Satoshi Nakamoto to create Bitcoin, as they have a lot of similar parallels. It ultimately was unsuccessful because it aimed to mimic real gold and back up another form of electric money, and then it was also never implemented. Finally, in 1998, B-Money was proposed by a developer named Wei Dai, and this also failed, but it also had an impact in the creation of Bitcoin. Then after that, really there wasn't any type of digital cash thing until Bitcoin was created in 2008. And we're going to cover a lot more, like, of course, Bitcoin's economics and whatnot in the next class session. But ultimately, oh, darn, I forgot to go over the Great Recession. Whoops. Where was that at? My bad. I'll try to get back to that. Well, I guess the Great Recession isn't too big of a deal. Mainly it was just, oh, there it is. Okay. Sorry, my PowerPoint slide was not showing that I had it. Okay, so 2007, 2009, this was really the first crisis, I believe, we've really seen of how the current fiat system can really just collapse in on itself pretty easily. Many of us, including me, actually lived during this time, but I mean, I was 10 years old. I had no idea what was going on. And this ultimately was kind of a lead up from the late 90s all the way through the mid 2000s of why this even happened. So from May of 2000 to June 2003, the Federal Reserve lowered the federal funds rate from 6.5% to 1%. The goal of this move was to boost the economy after the dot-com bubble and the 9/11 attacks. The result was this huge boom in home prices and lending at very low interest rates, even to high-risk borrowers. If you had no history of credit, or you had even terrible credit, you could take out a low interest rate loan for a house. Now, in background, there was a lot of sketchy things going on with banks and Wall Street pertaining to these subprime loans that were being tossed around, and this ultimately led to leveraged trades on the loans from huge banks like Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, Morgan Stanley, and many, many, many other subprime mortgage lenders. Eventually, the Federal Reserve hiked rates again, and home ownership peaked in 2004. Then in 2006, housing prices were dropping. And this, because house prices started to drop a lot, this caused any American that bought a house to lose a ton of money on the house too. They couldn't sell the house without owing money to the lenders. The most vulnerable subprime borrowers were stuck in this spot that they took out this loan, which they couldn't afford in the first place, which then led to, well, a lot of foreclosures. So one by one, in 2007, many subprime lenders started to file for bankruptcy. And even Bear Stearns stopped redemptions in 2 of its hedge funds. This really was just the start. It was apparent that the markets could not solve the subprime crisis, and soon everything started to just collapse. Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers and many other banks and home lenders completely collapsed, and the markets went into free fall. So what happened to save the economy? The government intervened, and many banks were completely unpunished for their dumb decisions. With a package of over $1.4 trillion to save the economy, banks all across the board were bailed out for their reckless behavior, but the economy got working again. This was honestly the first major shift that we've seen in recent history to this idea of Keynesian economics, and this is how we tend to operate today. Now, one thing out of this is that in 2009, Bitcoin was launched. So you can say that that was also another result of this. So, to today. After the great financial crisis, we saw the greatest bull market run in stock market history. And post-2009, any form of a savings account was practically worthless to inflation. Even government treasuries, the so-called least risky asset that one could buy, was not even outpacing inflation. So the market of last resort really, which has acted as kind of a savings account, has been the stock market. And it's also led us to where we are today. And of course, we've had COVID happen, but it's actually insane to me to look at the bull market run from post-2009 to now, because realistically, after government intervention of the stimulus in 2020, you just saw like the graph go up, 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 just crashed, and then it's just straight up again. But now, since December or beginning of January, we've just seen this gradual decline in the markets. So, I'm not a mathematician, but I don't think that our money supply should look like the beginning of an exponential equation. According to money supply data, $1 in 1959 to today is worth roughly 1.4 cents, a 98.6 decrease. And based on the math of $1 over this total supply. In just 2 years, since 2020, we've increased that money supply by 41%. And practically, I mean, thinking of that, our money is becoming worthless. So if you look on the chart, you see there is a clear spot where it starts to just go vertical. That was the COVID stimulus bill. So you've also likely heard of the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI. This is the measurement the government uses for inflation. But over time, I believe that ultimately this has been a flawed measurement for a few reasons. First reason being that the ones who create the measurement in the first place is the government, who actually has the ability to include and exclude data on the graph. So they have done this in the past, and a great example of this was Arthur Burns fighting inflation in the early 1970s by removing 65% of the goods that were being measured in the CPI data, and it still resulted in double-digit inflation in the 70s. So they figured out something's actually really wrong. The second reason it's also flawed is that there is no true base unit of measurement. So for an example, if I give you a 1 pound rock, you know that the rock is always going to be 1 pound, right? And if you somehow add weight to that rock, it's still measurable against the original weight of the rock of being 1 pound. With CPI, they measure the selected goods in a 12-month time frame, which gives this illusion that inflation is not that high if kept at a target rate of around 2% or lower. When realistically, if you just think about the mathematics of 2% inflation every single year, that interest compounds and will then lead to a huge amount of growth in the money supply. And just in 50 years at 2% inflation, you will have increased the money supply by over 100%, leading to over a 50% decrease in your purchasing power. The last reason that I believe CPI is flawed is that inflation really is a hard thing to measure. I think Michael Saylor explains this pretty well. He describes inflation as a vector. But what it means is that measuring a universal inflation rate is difficult to do if the inflation affects different goods in different ways. If you consider inflation as this vector, when each good and service has its own price inflation rate, then it becomes far easier to identify the impacts of inflation on individuals and their provision of the future. But there's a lot more to that argument that we're not going to really get into with this class. So, a little resource for you, which I apologize the name of this website, but it's called WTFhappened in1971.com. There's a lot of data on here that is definitely very interesting, from pre-1971 data to post-1971 data. And I just find it very fascinating to look at many of the graphs that are provided from a lot of government data alone. But I definitely recommend checking that out. So, on to the Cantillon effect. Named after the Irish-French economist Richard Cantillon, he explained that when you constantly increase the money supply, it leads to the devaluation of currency. However, the entities who either create or are the first to receive the newly created money are normally the ones that benefit the most, making them even more wealthy. So this happens due to the fact that newly created money allows for goods and services to be purchased at the current purchasing power of the dollar in the economy. But soon after, let's just go through a trickle down in the economy. If it starts at the government and corporations above and it trickles down all that money into the economy to when you get it as a wage, as a laborer, when it reaches the laborer, the purchasing power of that newly created money is actually decreased a lot. So normally we see that trickle-down effect from the government to the consumer. However, in COVID-19's case, when everyone received the stimulus checks, we saw the opposite flow, where consumers were able to spend the money at the current prices, then later causing prices to rise as the new supply reached businesses and then corporations, and ultimately flowing back to the government at the top. So history has shown that no matter what political party is in office in any nation, a government cannot escape the temptation of inflating the money supply, succumbing to human greed, and all these easy money benefits the producers the most. So, inflation's impact. Inflation, in my eyes, really is the representation of theft through a hidden tax from this complex form of incurring debt for the nation. Now, what hurts me is knowing that because we are told, or we hold the world reserve currency, the US dollar, and the United States keeps inflating our currency, it also affects every single country that holds the US dollars in their reserves, because then they have to inflate their own currency to match the true price of ours. And if they don't do that, the economy still gets out of whack, because then prices go up and they're not earning as much money as a laborer and consumer. So, according to research done by Steve Hanke and Charles Bushnell in 2016, there have been 57 instances of hyperinflation that has occurred throughout all of human history. Hyperinflation is defined by an increase of inflation of 50% over the course of a month. And out of the 57 times, 56 of them have occurred after World War I, and one has occurred before then, in 1795, when the French introduced a non-redeemable paper currency, the assignat. So, just keep that in mind. So, ultimately, how does fiat money work? So, fiat structure, there are 190 central banks who all are members of the International Money Fund, adhering to their rules and regulations, also imposed by the Federal Reserve. Then, under the central banks, there are thousands of private banks with many physical branches. This system is highly efficient in a centralized ledger technology, because there is one bank that decides the fate of every other central bank, called the U.S. Federal Reserve, which is in the middle of the picture. The Federal Reserve has the ability to kick any person from the network if they want to. This happened in 2012 to Iran, who were then allowed back onto the network in 2018. And in 2022, this happened to Russia and Belarus, who I highly doubt is going to come back on the network. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised to see China eventually be removed from SWIFT at some point, mainly due to just the geopolitical flames that are starting to brew in the world. But understand, SWIFT is a huge financial weapon, because it allows the messaging and debiting of accounts all across the world. So, fiat operations, really, the fiat system works on a debt-based system, denominated by US dollars, because it has the highest salability in the market and its dominance from the petrodollar. The US government does not really want another currency to be stronger, so any attempt to make that happen will likely result in geopolitical pressure, or also just pressure to inflate another currency against the US dollar, making the US dollar stronger. A lot of fiat money is created through lending, and there are many complex government rules and regulations that determine who can obtain a lending license that allows the entity to issue loans. The global interest rates are really determined by the Federal Reserve and then reflected across other central banks in the world accordingly. So, central bank has 4 important functions. They operate on a monopoly, providing the fiat money and determining its supply and price. They have a monopoly on the clearing of international payments, a monopoly authority over licensing and regulations of domestic banks, and then lending to its respective national government by buying the bonds so that money can be put into the supply. Now, central bank functions. Within each central bank, it has its own cash reserve account for its own local currency, but it also has an international cash reserve account for reserve currencies. Mainly the dollar is that reserve currency, which allows for these 4 functions to operate. With these 4 functions that are used, it does not really allow for a free market in private banking to be allowed, because there is this monopoly from the laws and regulations of central banks. Now, every single private bank has to go through this central bank function in order to operate, especially international trade. I do believe that in the fiat system, if people and private banks were allowed to choose the currency of their choice to use entirely within their countries without needing to go through the central bank, then maybe the fiat system would be a little better. But that isn't how the system works. With these 4 functions, the central banks are incentivized to protect their own interest at the expense of the long-term value of their own currency and wealth of their citizens. So, fiat mining. And we'll compare Bitcoin mining to this next lecture. But the fiat system was not designed to optimize the user experience of currency, transactions, and banking. Modern fiat money is not just created out of thin air by physically printing money. It really is a far more sophisticated system in its operation. The fundamental engineering feature of the fiat system is that it treats future promises of payment of money, what we call debt, as if it is as good as present money, as long as they are issued by the government or a licensed entity by the government. There is no effective restraint to any type of lending either, like other monetary technologies. Only various political, constitutional, and intellectual safeguards against inflation have sporadically, temporarily, and unreliably succeeded in controlling the debt creation underwritten by central banks. So the problem with injecting money into money supply and creating a massive amount of credit growth is trying to take that money supply back out. The most effective restraint against credit growth spiraling out of control are the deflationary periods we know as recessions that are more extreme based on the amount of false growth that we originally have. So we get into this cycle. And continually we hit inflation, we boom, we bust, deflation, political pressure to reflate because the economy is doing terrible, and then we reflate, and then it continues on. Okay. So, lending. The U.S. Congress and Federal Reserve are not the only entities capable of conjuring this money out of thin air. Any lending organization with this license can create money through lending, whether it be central banks or other world governments, private banks, and sublenders. Under a sound monetary system, all money has to be physically present, and you cannot settle a transaction between people unless you have the money to back up that transaction. So when a client goes to ultimately buy some type of good, they have that money saved in the first place. So let's imagine you're trying to buy a $1 million house. If you go try to buy that $1 million house under a sound monetary system, you actually have $1 million sitting in your bank account or in some sound money. Now, in this system, in lending, you can just take out that loan. And then the bank's like, all right, cool. We don't have the cash reserves, but here's $1 million. And then ultimately, what this leads to is this system we call fractional reserve banking, which we'll get into in a minute. But under the fiat system, there is this enormous incentive for getting into debt because you can enjoy a present good without the need for present money, but then you also have interest on top of that. But what happens is that the reason you're incentivized to get into debt is because no matter what, the dollar's purchasing power will dwindle over time. So if you can take on more debt now and try to figure out a way to actually make more money based on that debt, then ultimately you're in the run for the money and you do well. But otherwise, you do terrible and you ultimately go bankrupt. So fractional reserve banking is actually just absurd to me. When we have the operations of fractional reserve banking, which allows for this credit growth to happen, it works like this. A person with $1,000 can go deposit $1,000 into a bank account, and that bank only needs to keep 10% of that money in the cash reserve. So what does the bank do? Well, they lend out the other 90%. And what you get from just a $1,000 deposit eventually ends up being $9,000 more dollars being created if each bank chain reactioned and lended out 90% of the original deposit. So realistically, this is a crazy thing that blew my mind just thinking about it. Like, even if I just go take out a loan that is, I guess, normal in fiat operation of, say, buying a house, I'm actually inflating the economy in the end because then ultimately I'm taking that money, and that money is then going to the other person that had the house, or the seller of the house. They're depositing into a bank account, and then that money is then lent out, and so on and so forth. So really, fractional reserve banking creates a lot of the inflation that we actually see. So this operation, though, can just completely go into a spiral if one of these banks defaults, right? But, well, lucky for us, we have the FDIC. So the government, what they do is just, if one of these banks defaults and needs to have some type of cash reserve, the government will step in, create more money, and then give that to the consumer. Now, the unfortunate thing with this, too, is just the fact that ultimately it's, to me, it makes no sense that you would lend out 90% of the money with 10% just in reserves because, and the only reason this works is because if everybody went to the bank right now in the United States of America, every single bank would go bankrupt. Otherwise, the government bails them out. But it works because we don't go pull our money out of bank accounts. So it's a very, very interesting thing. So we're getting close to the end. This system is literally just like breaking before our eyes, and I'm going to go through an example to show this. And there's plenty of data in the markets to show it, but it's as if really nobody understands that this is actually happening, that our system is breaking. And I don't necessarily blame anybody. I mean, I've had to take 2 years to actually understand any of this, but it takes a lot of time and effort to understand the complexities that the system has created when it doesn't really need to be that complex. So let's think of the U.S. government as a company for a minute. The government has revenues and expenses just like any other company, and borrows money in the form of debt, just like any other business. But the thing is, though, it's able to buy its own debt through the Federal Reserve, which really is not a normal thing. It's pretty crazy. Now, about 95% of U.S. government revenue comes in the form of simple taxes: individual and corporate income tax, capital gains, payroll, excise tax, and the other 5% comes from estate and gift taxes, custom duties, earnings at the Fed, and other miscellaneous things. So just like a business, your revenue must be enough to cover all of the expenses to continue operating over time. And we will detail this in our budget, but within running a country, taxes are meant to cover all of the expenses that a government owes from its spending. So if we look at the 2020 fiscal budget, we can see overall there's a dilemma here. We have 6.6 trillion basically overall in this spending to cover 3.4 trillion of revenue, which obviously does not work. So, and this is pretty similar to 2022's budget and data, but there's a few options for the government to get out of the deficit that it's in. It can cut expenses, which government's not going to do that. I mean, have you seen like literally every single bill that we're sending to Ukraine right now? I mean, it's like actually nuts, but we are on a spending spree, so the government's not going to do that. You can generate more income by stimulating GDP, and Keynesians think that war is a great way to do this, or you can raise taxes, but people are going to get angry. So let's do some math. In 2022, from a Congressional Budget Office report, when we take into account U.S. federal debt, we are sitting at 31.1 trillion, which is just an insane number to think about. But overall, we also hold our debt to GDP ratio on the right over there. It's 139%. So we have way more debt than our actual GDP coming in. And it's not really great at first glance. But if we dig in deeper from the Congressional Budget Office report, we can look at a few things from this economic outlook. So, one second, I gotta find the exact numbers on this. So, let's do the math and try to keep this simple. When we normally look at GDP as an indicator of a nation's health, that's not really the main thing we need to look at. We have to look at all of the stuff in this account. So for 2022, the Congressional Budget Office report finds that the economic outlook from 2022 to 2032, and for 2022, we find that we have $3.7 trillion in entitlements and about $800 billion in defense spending. Now, our tax revenues we see up here is about $4.9 trillion to cover all of that expense. Okay, so overall, we have $400 billion left over to cover our interest on the loan we took out for our debt. Now, our interest expense is right here at $448 billion. So you can see that $400 billion does not obviously cover 448 billion. So we can't really pay our interest. So we have to take on more debt to cover the annual interest expense. With rising interest rates and our current debt matures and needs to be replaced, this additional interest cost adds up very quickly. For an example, if we take out a loan on the debt we owe currently at $31 trillion, at just an interest rate of 3.2%, we have $1 trillion of interest expense, 600 billion more than we do currently. And it's the same idea as practically moving one credit card balance to another credit card balance, and your credit score is going to keep dropping, and then your interest rate is going to keep going up. So realistically, the United States, honestly, is actually bankrupt. There really isn't a question about it, but because we're a global nation, nobody really wants to admit that. So we continue to kick this can down the road because interest rates are rising, and it's going to result in reduced tax revenues due to lower capital gains and the market selling off. So to avoid this, the Federal Reserve will have to resort to lowering rates by pivoting and resuming their quantitative easing by injecting money into the money's supply. So within the Congressional Budget Office report as well, they actually admit this too. They admit that we are completely screwed. And it blows my mind, honestly. So the only choice that realistically we have is to let inflation run hot by raising our target inflation rate from 2%, and also hope that we raise GDP to monetize the debt. So realistically, with any of the prices that we have currently with inflation, they're not coming back down. They are likely going to stay where they are and ultimately over time gradually increase. So finally, the last slide. Ultimately, I believe it is no coincidence that under a fiat standard, many things have broken and will continue to break as time goes on. I mean, it's very difficult to reverse this whole entire process of fiat money. World governments mandate that taxes are paid in government money. They control and regulate the banking systems and create a high salability for fiat money. So really, you don't have a choice. But with rising prices we see today, like I said, they're not going to come back down, and we likely will result in higher inflation and possibly stagflation or hyperinflate. Other governments across the world are also losing trust to the United States, and we have seen this now with what's called the BRICS nations, and this includes like Russia, China, South Africa, Brazil, and India. And this is a new formation of a world power. The way out, in my eyes, is really Bitcoin, because it is honestly insurance against an all-out collapse of fiat currency, and the best suitable money, I believe, to replace fiat. So next week, we're going to discuss the economics of Bitcoin based on what we went over today, and how Bitcoin really works along with live demonstrations of Bitcoin. Thank you. I'm sorry that took so long. Are there any questions? Oh, all right, cool. Got that done in an hour 30. Yes?
What does the word fiat mean?
Yes, so the question was, what does the word fiat mean? It is the Latin term for a decree or authorization, and this is mostly used in the government term, so money by decree. Yeah.
For
money by decree or authorization.
You said earlier, it's Latin for either decree or.
Authorization. Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. Appreciate it. Don't think there's anything in the Zoom. Yeah.
I wondered what this world is tonight.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it's honestly insane to just think about, like, I mean, just 2 weeks ago, we saw the United Kingdom, and their pension plans actually almost completely collapsed, meaning any person that had a pension would have woke up in the morning and all of it had been gone. But the government intervened and injected $65 billion into the markets.
That doesn't really exist.
Correct, yes, that doesn't exist. So the Bank of England injected this money, and if you go look at the UK's 30-year gilt, which is their bond, if you go look at it, you can clearly see there's a skyrocket in the interest on the UK gilt, and then it just staggers like this, and it actually drops and then just kind of levels out. Because now the Bank of England is just continually buying their own bond just to make sure that people's retirement funds are safe. And it's madness. Like, so realistically, looking at a country like the UK, who is like this global power, like for them to be struggling like they are, and then now we have the whole energy crisis in Europe going on, there's a lot to come, and very, very crazy. And Japan's another great example too, of they are just completely inflating their currency right now, and it's ridiculous. But yeah, it's interesting stuff.
So when Putin decided that he was only going to sell his oil for rubles,
Mm-hmm.
is that so that he would hurt other people's petrodollars?
Correct, yes. Mm-hmm. Because then only, I believe the deal that they had made was the fact that I think they were going to trade it with India, and India was also going to buy from like Iran and Saudi Arabia. So then Russia could actually get an import of oil through that way.
So that's financially hurting the U.S. and Europe.
Correct, because now Russia and also China are not buying any type of or funding any type of United States debt. So they're not buying our bonds. In fact, actually, China has not bought any United States treasuries since I think 2014. And I think Russia stopped in 2012, I think. But yeah, Russia, I think, has completely sold all of it. And then China still has some, but they are also selling. And then Japan this year is now dumping their treasury just to protect the yen. So yeah, it's this is why today, if you look at the United States bond market, this is crazy. If you would have bought a United States bond at the beginning of 2022, the least risky asset that you could take on, you would be down over 40% right now, which is it blows my mind. And so, yeah, it's just the interest rates on bonds right now are skyrocketing, and I mean, we can see that if you go look at all of our treasuries and the yields of them, but it's going to be interesting to see what the Federal Reserve does. That I pay attention to what they do all the time. So, yeah, it's just wild. Well, if there's no other questions, that's all I got for today. And I appreciate your time very greatly.
I'm surprised the euro didn't collapse.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but earlier with Greece and
Right.
that whole
Yeah,
situation.
I believe,
A lot of countries in a lot worse.
right, and like also the UK and Brexit. I believe the euro will not be a thing in the next 20 years, personally. 20 years, yeah. Mainly because Europe, I think, is getting to a point where they all, as individual nations, are becoming so unstable that they will likely just get off the euro system. And it's kind of incredible just to think about that. But yeah, I mean, we'll see.